Good afternoon, prominent speakers, distinguished guests, colleagues, students, and friends. My name is Kelvin Chung, a fresh graduate of the Bachelor of Arts and Sciences in Global Health and Development program from the University of Hong Kong School of Public Health. I will be your Master of Ceremonies today. On behalf of the school, I welcome you all to the distinguished lecture, Lancet at 200, Looking Back and Looking Forward. Today, we have our participants in the boardroom as well as online. Thank you all for joining us. To begin with, I would like to refer you to today's rundown. We will first begin with some welcoming remarks by Professor Vivian Lin, followed by an introduction of the speaker by Professor David Bishai. Then Dr. Horton will be presenting our keynote speech today, followed by Dr. Mary Schooling and Professor Maggie Wang, who will be presenting the commentator session. Last but not least, Professor Malik Paris will be presenting the Q&A session. If you would like to refer to the program rundown later on, you may scan the QR code using your device to access the information online. And without further ado, allow me to invite Professor Vivian Lin, Executive Associate Dean of the Li Ka-shing Faculty of Medicine, to give the welcoming remarks. Professor Lin, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Faculty of Medicine, can I extend the warmest welcome, not only because it is warm, but because this is also a celebratory event. We get to say happy birthday to Lancet. And we're so privileged to have with us the editor-in-chief. Now, we don't need to talk about the importance of Lancet to this audience, because many of you are either Lancet authors or you aspire to become that. But I think we also need to recognize that Lancet is more than a high impact factor journal. And we have Richard with us in Hong Kong because we've actually just had a very fruitful day-and-a-half meeting of the Tsinghua Lancet Commission on Health and Eco-Civilization. And I know that Professor Peng Gong will be here shortly as the chair of that commission, and we thank him for bringing Richard to us in Hong Kong. But I also want to acknowledge the presence of Dr. Margaret Chan as the chair of another Tsinghua Lancet Commission on poverty alleviation through health. And I think it's these larger efforts that really make Lancet more than a journal, and to help us really get a focus on some of the really important experiences of this region and how we can inform the rest of the world. So I think it's going to be great to hear Richard as he reflects on the mission of Lancet, not only what it has achieved, but how it moves forward and how we, as part of the Lancet community, are also contributors to that effort. So again, thank you for coming and joining in the celebrations.
Thank you, Professor Lin. Please be seated. May I now invite Professor David Bishai, Director of School of Public Health, to introduce our keynote speaker virtually. Professor Bishai, please.
Hello, I'm Professor David Bishai, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, because on the 5th of October of this year, the venerable journal, The Lancet, will be 200 years old. When we venerate something, we offer respect because of age, wisdom, and character. At nearly 200 years old, The Lancet is clearly venerated for age. Its wisdom comes from generations of contributors, some of whom are in the room with us. The Lancet's venerable character today comes in no short amount from its current editor-in-chief, who is our guest today, Dr. Richard Horton, an officer of the Order of the British Empire. The character of a journal comes from an editorial vision that integrates science into the life of humankind. Thanks to Dr. Horton's vision, Friday mornings bring us much more than a sterile recitation of p-values and effect sizes. When we wake up on Friday, our inbox has a toolkit to help us bridge from the frontier of knowledge to the frontier of human possibility. The scene of possibility for Lancet readers to apply what they read includes clinics and surgeries and hospitals, but it is expanded into legislatures, ministries, boardrooms, and neighborhoods. Lancet's pages carry Dr. Horton's vision that health is determined by social and political forces informed by evidence. His presence tonight at a school of public health in a faculty of medicine could not be more fitting, because the character that he has brought to the Lancet unifies the toolkit of 21st century public health and medicine. During COVID-19, Dr. Horton was a leading voice to sound the alarm about the virus. The Lancet published pivotal papers in January 2020, 6 weeks before the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 to be a pandemic. Preserving and defending the Lancet's reputation for the highest standards of evidence in today's age of mistrust is a feat for which we all owe him gratitude. Biography: Dr. Horton was born in London, trained in medicine at Birmingham. He joined the Lancet in 1990 and was appointed editor-in-chief 5 years later at the age of 33. Under his leadership, the Lancet has become the premier venue for global health science. He has won numerous awards, including the Rue Prize, a Friendship Award from the government of China, and he was elected as a Foreign Associate of the United States Institute of Medicine. He's an honorary professor at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, University College London, and University of Oslo. His comments today are on the Lancet at 200, looking back and looking forward. From the perspective of what we have all just come through, and for the man who led the journal that helped us to get here, I personally feel profound gratitude. And if ever there was a cause to venerate both an institution and a man, to indulge in this respect for wisdom and character, we have that cause today. And I will now turn the podium to Dr. Richard Horton.
Thank you, Professor Bishai, for the introduction. May I now invite Dr. Richard Horton, Editor-in-Chief of the Lancet, to the stage to share with us Lancet at 200, looking back and looking forward. Dr. Horton, please.
This reflects my age, just in case. Professor Lin, Professor Bishai, thank you very much indeed for your very generous welcome. And let me also acknowledge the presence of my long-standing friend, Director General, you'll always be Director General, Chan. Margaret, it's lovely to see you in the audience. Thank you for being here. No slides. So you're going to have to concentrate. Exactly 1 week ago, I was standing in a witness box at the United Kingdom COVID inquiry, affirming an oath to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. To my left was Baroness Heather Hallett, a member of the House of Lords, a retired Court of Appeal judge, and chair of the public inquiry into the United Kingdom government's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. In front of me was Hugo Keith, KC, the lead counsel for the inquiry. And to my right was the public gallery, where sat family members of those who had been bereaved by COVID-19. It was the first time that I had stepped into a witness box in my life, and it was a sobering experience, I can tell you. Not only because of the gravity of the subject. This was module 1 of the inquiry and was focusing on whether the United Kingdom had been sufficiently prepared for SARS-CoV-2. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. But it was also a significant moment because I was wrestling with this word truth. the discovery of which is the purpose of Baroness Hallett's endeavor. Just pause for a moment and consider, hold this word, the truth, in your hands. What is the truth? As the pandemic revealed all too damagingly, truth can be a very slippery concept indeed. Truth can be easily subverted, easily manipulated, or simply dismissed, discarded. The currency of your work and the currency of my work is truth. And I would submit to you that we are together on the front line of not one of the, but I would say the most important and existential struggle of our time, the struggle for truth. And the choices that you and I make in the coming years will shape, will determine the future of humanity. But first, a moment of humility, because truth is complicated. There are many different kinds of truth that we need to consider. There are divine truths, the truths that come from your particular faith. There are moral truths, truths that guide the way you live your lives in society. If you're a rationalist, there are reasoned truths. If you're an empiricist, there are truths that derive from experiment. If you're an artist, there are truths that come from the creative process. There might be your truth, but I might have a different truth. There are relative truths between us. There are truths that are truths because the powerful decree them to be truths. And there are esoteric truths, mysterious truths hovering in the ether, waiting to be discovered. So if you were standing in that witness box today, accountable to those families who, in my view, had lost relatives because of the utter negligence of the governing class of my country, what would be your truth? Now, you very kindly gave me the title for this talk today, The Lancet at 200, Looking Back and Looking Forward. But I would like, with your permission, to use that title as a departure point, to talk about an issue that is far more important than the past or the future of one medical journal. In chic dinner parties on the west coast of the United States, it's common to play a certain game. And that game is called P-Doom. P brackets doom, D-O-O-M, close brackets. The probability of human catastrophe within our lifetimes. What do we judge to be the probability of human catastrophe within our lifetime? Lord Martin Rees, past president of the Royal Society in the United Kingdom, has estimated that we have a 50% chance of survival by the end of the century. Not so good, 50%. What would your percentage be by the end of the century, our chance of survival? We all have our own thoughts and reflections about the threats that face us. And in an effort to try and bring some coherence to this question, we established a Lancet Commission on 21st Threats to Global Health last year. And we held our first meeting at the Robert Koch Institute in Berlin in March this year. We constructed a scale, a very simple scale to begin with. On the extreme left, utopia. On the extreme right, extinction. And somewhere between utopia and extinction, we try to locate some of the threats that we face. Terrorism, embodied perhaps by 9/11, lay somewhere in the middle. Genocide, the genocide in Rwanda being an example, was a little further along towards extinction. The pandemic, that was 3/4 of the way along towards extinction. And war, and perhaps informed by events that are taking place closer to Berlin than to Hong Kong, I mean, what's taking place in Ukraine at the moment was further along still. Our goal in this commission is to try and quantify these threats, threats of the climate crisis, biodiversity loss, inequality, fertility decline, political populism, even artificial intelligence. But the consensus at that first meeting, I will confess not mathematically proven, but a consensus all the same, was that misinformation, anti-science, and mistrust in evidence, public mistrust in evidence, was the most important threat facing global health in the 21st century. One of the strangest events that I took part in last year was in Quakers Hall on the Euston Road in London, where 1,000 people one rainy evening gathered to listen to a speaker whose name was Dr. Aseem Malhotra. Aseem Malhotra is a cardiologist in private practice in the United Kingdom. He's registered as a member of the General Medical Council, so he is registered to practice as a doctor. And he was there to give a talk claiming that COVID vaccines have zero impact on hospitalization and mortality from COVID-19, that mRNA vaccines are indeed explicitly harmful, and that real-world data, whatever that means, showed that mRNA vaccines are the source of unprecedented danger to our communities. His message, which was received with messianic admiration and applause, was that we need to suspend the use of vaccines immediately. And the audience warmed to his allegations of conspiracy and cover-up by the medical industrial complex. If you're brave and you go to his Twitter feed, you will see how he is fostering doubt and controversy, not only about COVID vaccines, but also about the use of statins in heart disease and stents for coronary disease. But he is not alone. Among the United Kingdom public, 1/3 of the population believe that it is definitely or probably true that white Europeans are being replaced by non-white immigrants. 1/3 of the British population believe that it is definitely or probably true that the media and the government are involved in a conspiracy to cover up information about terrorist attacks. A quarter of the British population believed that COVID was a hoax. One could smile or perhaps sigh in a rather resigned way about findings such as these. But as the editor of a scientific journal, it won't surprise you that I find these results absolutely terrifying. In Jonathan Rauch's 2021 book entitled The Constitution of Knowledge, he talks about liberal society being based on 3 operating systems. A political operating system that is about how we distribute power across society. An economic operating system about how we distribute scarce resources. And thirdly, an often neglected epistemic operating system about how we deploy truth to aid our decision-making in society. And the case he made in his book is that the epistemic operating system is under acute attack. Witness the surge in climate skeptic tweets after Elon Musk discarded fact-checking protections on Twitter in the name of what he called free speech. Now, how should we, in the scientific, medical, and public health communities, respond? Science communication, the way it's normally been taught in the modern era, has relied on an information deficit model when responding to misinformation. The best way to overcome the damage caused by bad speech is to drown it out with better speech. And we call this the marketplace of ideas, that our words in our community compete with one another in a market, and that the best test of truth that we have today is our ability to get our words and ideas accepted by others in that marketplace. But that common view is dangerous nonsense. We are not rational beings. We have a programmed inability to process information and to make decisions based on the most reliable evidence. The marketplace of ideas, which governs how we deal with misinformation today, is a treacherous myth, especially in an era of social networks. We are all of us in this room, easily susceptible to false beliefs based on the testimony of others. And the errors of science, and there are errors of science, inadvertent and occasionally deliberate, are exploited by some to turbocharge mistrust in the entire scientific enterprise. Now, there are some disconcerting, but yet fundamental facts about social networks that we need to understand if we're to begin to defeat misinformation. When someone shares what they believe to be evidence, our natural tendency is to believe what we read. That's proven by many, many psychological experiments. And the very fact that we have a tendency to believe what we read means that social networks have opened a very large door to the spread of false beliefs. Belief, any belief you have, depends upon your trust in the person who is delivering a piece of information to you. If you mistrust that person, you won't believe them. If you mistrust and therefore you don't believe, it will be 100% impossible to arrive at a consensus about the truth, whether we're talking about an mRNA vaccine or the safety of statins. And the greater the mistrust that you have in the speaker, the more you will be attracted to false beliefs. In a situation like that, where our belief is governed by our trust, in an era of social networks, it doesn't matter how much factual information we pour into the system, we distribute to try and overcome those false beliefs. If people don't trust us, more information will make absolutely no difference. The starting point, if we're going to address misinformation, is not more information, it is about trust. To make matters worse, I'm afraid that we also suffer two debilitating biases as human beings. The first is that we suffer from a conformity bias. We have, every one of us, an inbuilt desire to agree with one another. It doesn't sometimes feel like it, but we do. We need to feel part of a group. So it's often hard when we're part of a group to challenge a belief in that group that we may disagree with, we may believe is mistaken. And so when the conformity bias kicks in, false beliefs are sustained and they snowball. The second bias that we suffer, and this is very relevant in my job, is that media, including scientific journals, are attracted not only to the true, but also to the new. We suffer from a novelty bias. And I want to be the first to admit that when we sit round a table discussing papers, if there is an eye-catching finding that surprises us, that interests us, then yes, we want to consider publishing that paper. But what we must never forget is that the new is only a subset of the totality of available evidence. And so there is a risk that it will mislead us. So into this toxic environment of mistrust, false belief, conformity bias, novelty bias, may step the propagandist, the person who operates in bad faith, the person who sets out deliberately to spread false information. The system of social networks that we have today, combined with our own natural frailties, leads us to be exquisitely vulnerable to the work of propagandists. Now, let me just be very clear about what I am saying and what I'm not saying. I'm definitely not saying that we should label all dissent from orthodoxy as anti-science. That is not what I'm saying. Dissent is good for science, and to ban dissent would be bad science and bad politics. Contrarians, people who take a different position to the orthodoxy, have a very important role in preventing groupthink. And I might argue, indeed, I did argue 1 week ago in the witness box, that It was groupthink that contributed in Western countries, and certainly in the United Kingdom, to not paying enough attention to the possibility of a virus other than influenza as a threat to UK national security, especially after the events of 2002, 2003, about which you know far more than I do. And Cass Sunstein, in his 2021 book entitled Liars, Falsehoods and Free Speech in an Age of Deception, goes even further. He wants to protect the right to dissent, and he argues that false statements, he's writing as an American, should be constitutionally protected unless we, the government, can show that they threaten to cause serious harm. I'm also definitely not saying that we should be hostile to those who believe what we might consider to be misinformation. Being hostile to those who hold what we think to be false beliefs is not going to solve the problem. Human beings, it is a fact that we have to embrace. Human beings are simply vulnerable to deception. Our feelings influence the way we perceive and process information. If you're angry, if you're in love, if you're fearful, if you're sad, if you feel isolated, your emotions will shape the way you ingest information that is given to you. One could call them the emotional determinants of health. We have another commission on that. So, what should we do? As the editor of a scientific journal, one can feel pretty powerless in the face of some of these forces. But there are some simple things that we mustn't forget. Simple things that actually have forces working against them at the moment. Let me take a very obvious one. You would rightly say that a journal like the Lancet should prioritize quality science. And I agree with you. But we're in a very perverse situation in the world of scientific publishing today. The importance of open science should not be contested. It should be embraced. But the open access model of publishing has created a strange, perverse incentive. The incentive now, because there's a sum of money attached to the publication of each paper, is to focus more on the volume of papers published in an open access journal, rather than the quality of papers published in a journal. In the old days, in the non-open access era, one could publish very few papers. As long as they were of high quality, that could be the yardstick of your measure. But the model of publishing shifting to an open access now, editors are feeling the pressure to publish more papers and pay less attention to their quality. And you have seen recently some editorial boards of journals resign en masse because they have been given instructions by their publisher to publish many, many more papers, because that will deliver more revenue for the publisher. And the editors have rebelled and said they want to focus on quality. So there is this tension between quality and quantity. And at the moment, at least from where I sit, the pressure for the needle to move more towards quantity is very, very high. So we have to defend as a community the importance of quality in scientific publishing. It seems so obvious to say it, but I promise you from where I sit, I see it being undermined and threatened on a regular basis. We should invest more than we do in peer review. We need to actively manage risk when we review papers. We need to identify whether a paper is at particular risk. Here, I worry about preprints. We had an episode just in the last few weeks where a preprint was submitted to the Lancet's preprint server. Preprints are checked by an editor, but one slipped through. And it was a preprint that didn't directly, but indirectly raise some questions about the safety of COVID vaccines. And within a matter of hours, this has been picked up on Twitter, drawn to our attention. We immediately reviewed the paper again, and we were able to take the paper off our preprint server. We're fortunate in that we're able to check preprints and take them down quickly if a mistake has been made, and clearly a mistake was made in this particular case. But as the pressure for preprints grows and grows, my worry is that we risk polluting the scientific literature with non-peer-reviewed papers that can raise signals of concern, which in an age of misinformation could be extremely dangerous and inflammatory. We should beware novelty. We should try to correct errors quickly. And we must place any new finding we publish in the context of the totality of the available evidence. And here, artificial intelligence might actually help us. Doing a systematic review is a challenging task, but there are language models being tested at the moment which can do a systematic review of the literature faster than any human being can do a systematic review. So there is a possibility that AI will give us the opportunity to more reliably integrate new evidence into existing evidence and publish that integrated evidence alongside the new evidence. So it's not all bad with AI. But we can and we must do a lot more than those few things. We, you and I as a community, I believe, must make the defeat of misinformation a much more central objective of science. Yes, we should defend freedom of expression and constructive dissent, but we also need to make the case for the appropriate regulation of misinformation. We can do more to anticipate misinformation, what's called pre-bunking, as opposed to debunking. We knew in the early part of the pandemic that mRNA vaccines were being developed. It was a possibility at that early time that we could have started to tell the story about mRNA vaccines before the first data became available. Because one of the questions raised about the safety of vaccines was, how did we produce a vaccine in 12 months when normally it takes 10 years? These vaccines cannot possibly have been produced to the same level of safety standards as one would normally expect, when of course mRNA vaccines have been worked on for at least 20 years in other spheres of medicine. But we didn't do that. We waited until it was too late, until the seeds of misinformation and concern were being sown, and it was too difficult to address those concerns. We should also think about how we deploy expertise. During the course of the pandemic, many scientists were appearing on radio and television to explain the meaning of data and to give confidence in the measures being asked of us, whether they were lockdowns, use of masks, physical distancing, or vaccines. And often those experts spoke, well, like experts. To me, that was great. We never had a better opportunity to put scientists in front of the media. But was it successful in building trust in the science? Would it have been better to have others in society, people more socially connected to parts of the public, who could have been representatives, advocates for the science, not only the scientists? We also need to demonstrate empathy as well as our expertise, and we shouldn't do it just once. We need to do it repeatedly again and again and again and again to build trust with the public. So finally, at last, to your question, the Lancet at 200, looking back and looking forward. Our task, looking forward, especially through our commissions and series, is to show again and again that the academic community, our universities, our research is a supremely valuable, indeed critical resource to guide and to support decision makers in our society, to protect all of the myriad social gains that we've achieved through the work of our universities and research, and to strengthen the resilience and the sustainability of our communities for the future. I'm very pleased to have my colleague, Dr. Helena Wang here, our editor based in Beijing, but covering the whole of Asia in her large arm span. Thank you, Helena, for all your work. Our common prospects together on this oh so delicate, but oh so dazzling planet of ours depend on your success and my success in turning the tide against misinformation. Let's get to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Horton. Please be seated. Thank you again for delivering a truly inspiring speech. I'm certain that we have each gained new perspectives from your valuable insights. We will now proceed to the commentator session.
Sorry.
May I invite the first commentator, Dr. Mary Schooling, Honorary Associate Professor and Cluster Leader of Non-Communicable Diseases of the School of Public Health, to share with us. Dr. Schooling, please.
Good afternoon. I'm honored to be here, and thank you for inviting me to give this. And I think what Dr. Horton has given us is a very compelling view of our weaknesses, then in terms of how we view science and how we do things. And one thing I want to do is reflect on going backwards in time, when we have had equally bad times where people have believed all sorts of amazing things and then recovered from them. If we think of Europe in the 1940s, people were in some parts of Europe believing almost anything about their fellow men and women. And the fact that we had those views and then recovered from them gives me some sort of hope that we could recover from the misinformation we're getting now, that it's not inevitable. We don't have to be like this. And a lot of it is our trust in governments, how open they are as to whether we can believe them. And I think the other thing that happens is that we can normalize extraordinary behavior, as has happened at lots of different times in history. And somehow to normalize the behavior where we listen to science, where we trust people. That's something, if it can be untaught, it can be taught, because we are such social beings. We want to copy each other. And I think one of the things in public health that I've always thought, that when we were trying to persuade people of things, we've often tried to persuade them by telling them facts. And I think facts have absolutely no effect on anybody. You know, they're completely irrelevant. What we want is things that people can see some benefit to them in doing, whether it's, you know, one seems to me very influential way of changing people is make things fashionable. People want to be fashionable. So if you can make science fashionable, or actually following science fashionable in some way, then it's going to be much more successfully emulated. So it's about creating those values across society, maybe starting with education, that we may be able to reverse some of the things that have happened in the last sort of 10 years. I mean, I even believe in the UK that somehow the exhibition we've had of politicians telling us complete lies, and then us finding out 6 years later that we're a lot poorer, has made us think again about the lies that can be told to us. But it's something that has to be reinforced all the time. And I think it's something that has always been with us. So I think that's, I think the only other bit is how we can tackle it within the science we do, not just in society, but in the science we do, that we are forever not trying to do what other people want, but what we believe to be true. And that also is difficult with the current pressures in academia, where we're asked to be, you know, where the pressure is on us to publish in the high impact journal, which might like something a bit similar to what it had before than some wild new ideas. So I think that we too are subject to these things, that we too in academia follow the fashion, and that can detract as well, just as much. You know, we all believed for years and years and years, you know, about fat being bad for us, but the evidence was never there. We, just like everybody else, should have gone by the evidence. So we too can do this. So what was being said about misinformation, in a sense, applies to us in society and in academia. And I hope that in all ways, we can combat it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Schooling. Please be seated. May I now invite the second commentator, Professor Maggie Wang, Associate Professor of the Jockey Club School of Public Health and Primary Care, the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Professor Wang, please.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be here. And it's a brilliant talk and reminder from Dr. Horton on the misinformation age. Our youngsters, this entire society is subject to the influence of media, social media, the voices without evidence influencing our children, our students, and people surrounding us. And when I hear his speech, it's reminding me the critical importance of these journals. Lancet, alongside with other well-recognized journals, as a gatekeeper of science, the top level, the best level of science and medicine, the gatekeeper of the observed truth that we collected and we surveyed and we investigated from the natural world. So the published articles documented what we observed from the experiments and from the surveys and epidemiology studies, etc. And these truths are critically important. It's the most valuable and precious asset as human society we process. So, but at one point of Professor Horton's point is there are many voices, large voices in social media as a key opinion leader. Why not? Very good scientists can also be an opinion leader to educate the public about what is evidence, what is scientific evidence, to educate the society what should be believed and what should be cautious about. So, but often the case, our scientists are too prudent to stand out. We are used to work in the lab and write papers, but we are not used to speak out in TV interviews, etc. But I think many of the professors seated here has done a great job in educating the public, and I think we should continuously to do that scientific education. And the next point is scientific tradition, the tradition of doing good, solid scientific work. It's definitely and absolutely a tradition followed from supervisor to students, students as new supervisors to his students, and so on and so on. So it's a very, very good culture that we should treasure and protect and remain the bar and standards of reporting scientific results, although eye-catching outcome is always attractive for submitting to top impact journals, but still the basic criteria and the bottom line is the observed truth and the good evidence that we can obtain and we should report. And lastly, as a biostatistician and bioinformatician, I teach all the postgraduate and undergraduate level biostatistics courses. And one of the basic concepts we teach in class is the type 1 error and type 2 error. Type 1 error is the false positive rate. It is usually kept at the golden standard of 5%, magic p-values criteria, whereas the type 2 errors criteria, the threshold is 20%. And the type 1 error is the guardians of the amount of false positive, the false positive rate, where the type 2 error is the false negative rate. So as you see that we, from the classical framework of statistics and scientific reporting, should have very good criteria and strict criteria of maintaining the quality of papers, although being in the pressure of the current age of volume. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Wang. Please be seated. Next, we will be opening the floor for questions from the audience. For those present in the boardroom, kindly raise your hand and wait until you're called upon to ask your question. Once acknowledged, please press the talk button on the microphone at your seat. Introduce your name, your organization, and state your question. Please also remember to mute your microphone afterwards. And for those participating in the Zoom webinar, kindly state your name, organization, and send your questions through the Q&A box provided. Now, Professor Malik Pieris, Chair Professor of Virology at the HKU School of Public Health, will facilitate the Q&A session. May I now invite Dr. Horton and Professor Pieris to the stage. Please, thank you.
Thank you, Richard, for an extremely depressing but a realistic lecture, and something that pertains not just to clinical medicine or to public health, but to society in general. I'm sure there are many questions out there, and please raise your hands. Let me just get the ball rolling with one. You mentioned that you were at the inquiry in UK, and obviously focus would be on the things that went wrong. But there were things that went right. And one of the things that really went right that strikes me about the UK uniquely was its clinical research effort. I mean, you know, the large scale clinical trials and also clinical research overall, which involved coordination of, you know, multiple hospitals across the NHS. I mean, that was amazing. Do you have any insights as to what actually led to that success? Because no other country achieved it. I mean, I wish to think that Hong Kong would have done so if we had been hit with a pandemic, but we were not. But anyway.
Well, it's interesting about the things that we did well. One or two government ministers in the UK claimed that Brexit made our response to the pandemic a fantastic success. And the reason was that Brexit caused such chaos in government at the end of 2019. We were in absolute crisis that we became match fit, was the phrase used by Michael Gove, to respond to the crisis of Brexit. So when the pandemic came, we were ready because we already had one crisis we were dealing with. So it was easy to handle another crisis. A very interesting explanation for why Brexit was a good thing. You're absolutely right. We did a fantastic job in setting up the recovery trial. In fact, I would say the scientific community generally did a great job, both in terms of, and they haven't always got a good press about this, which I think is very unfair, but in terms of the modeling work that was done that went into SAGE, our Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, and certainly on the clinical trial side. Now, I think the reason why we did so well on the trials, it goes back basically to the era of Richard Doll. There's been a lineage of clinical research in Oxford that began with Richard Doll, evolved to Richard Peto and Rory Collins. Their work in cardiovascular trials, looking at thrombolytics and indeed statins and many other drugs. They built up a fantastic randomized trial capacity in Oxford and have been passionate advocates for trials, large, simple trials. And now there's a new generation of researchers following Richard and Rory, Peter Horby, for example. So when you have a crisis, the entire system in Oxford was perfectly set up to have trials to kick in. The NHS, which is, I will confess, going through a slightly wobbly phase at the moment. But the good thing about the NHS was that they had the capacity through NHS research and development programs to set up trial centres very rapidly and recruit patients into the large and simple recovery trial. So yes, it was a stunning success. I would also say it went beyond clinical trials. We didn't have it before, but we were able very rapidly to set up genomic sequencing, which was absolutely crucial. Now, my worry is that unfortunately governments have short memories. And so the genomic sequencing capacity that we set up is now being wound down. The clinical trial capacity and the way we broke through bureaucracies, the worry is that those bureaucracies will reconstitute themselves, and the barriers that Richard and Rory fought against for so long will come back. So how do one of the important parts of this inquiry is protecting the things that we did do well and making sure that we don't lapse back into the bad old ways. Go on.
Any questions from the floor? Yes.
Oh, good.
Linway. Please identify yourself and.
My name is Lin Wei Tian from School of Public Health. My question is, it is that 80%, 90% of the say literature will turn out to be wrong, say 10 years later. And then probably Lancet, or somehow I'm wondering Lancet or other good journals, and then their percentage can be lower. Say like 50% or 10%.
Oh, that's my objective, is it? Only to be 50% wrong. You know, there's been a debate about the how reliable and reproducible is the scientific literature, and not even in 10 years' time, but actually now. And people like John Ioannidis have made some pretty strong claims that there are parts of the medical firmament which have particularly unreliable results, and he's focused on cancer clinical trials as one example. I think that he exaggerates to make a point, but I do think there are some interesting questions to raise there. And I've written about this and have been extensively misquoted, actually. If you go into a different disciplinary sphere, say the physics community, the particle physics community, and you're at the Large Hadron Collider, and you're trying to discover some new particle, well, you only get one shot at this in the history of the universe, and you've got literally hundreds, if not thousands, of physicists collaborating to bring two beams to hit one another and try and create a new particle. You've got one shot. So what level of probability do you set yourself to be absolutely sure that the result is correct? Well, they don't choose p less than 0.05. What they do is they set the parameters much, much more tougher than that. And so the question is, should we rethink the level that we accept evidence at? Not necessarily to go as far as the physicists do, but maybe we don't go far enough. Some, and I just mentioned a friend of mine, somebody I greatly admire, Ken Rothman, in the previous session. Ken always used to argue we should dispense with p-values anyway, and just have confidence intervals in papers. And I used to wear a T-shirt that was that would have a p-value and then a red circle with a line across it to say we should ban them. I don't do that anymore. But there is a case to be made that our criteria for what we accept as evidence may be a little too relaxed. In terms of what's right now and what's going to be wrong in the future, I mean, this is the beauty of medicine. The frame changes, our understanding of disease changes. You know, when I was practicing medicine a long time ago, the only treatments we had for heart failure was a bit of oxygen and some frusemide. There wasn't much else. And now the treatments for heart failure, you know, are vast. And so the frame in which we look at disease and the opportunities we look at disease renders the evidence from a previous generation redundant. And in the future, the evidence we have now will be redundant. You know, in the days when Richard and Roy did their studies on thrombolytics, that was the gold standard. Now it's stents, despite a seen Malhotra. So it's difficult with medicine to say that this is like a pebble of a fact, a stone of a fact that isn't going to change in the future, because that's the beauty of medicine. It does change. It's not physics.
Yeah, so there's a question that has come in about the Lancet commissions.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as a journal, I think you're preeminent in setting up many commissions. First and foremost, how do you how to decide on what topics, and if somebody out there has an area or a question that they think is worthy of such a commission, how would they set about it or approach you?
Okay. richard.horton@lancet.com is my email address. So please write to me if you have a bright idea. My attitude, but this drives my colleagues crazy, but my attitude is it's like spinning plates. You set up as many of these projects as possible. Some of them will fail. Many of them will succeed. And you just need to project manage them extremely well, which we do our best to do. The idea behind a commission is that if you bring a group of smart people from the academic community around a table from different disciplines to address a neglected problem and put them to work for 2 years, they will come up with something wholly original that nobody had thought of before that could have, should have immediate policy relevance. The very first commission we did was in 2009. It was on health and climate change. And I was having meetings with people at University College London. We were talking about climate and how the world was going to pieces and what we were going to do about it. And then we said, well, you know what? Climate, it's got all these different elements. You know, there is the climate science, there's health, there's politics, there's economics, there's engineering, all of this stuff. How are we going to bring people together? And then a little light bulb went on. The university, the only institution human beings have created on this planet that can bring people together from different disciplines, is the university. Why aren't we bringing people together in a university across faculties, across departments, to work together on solving problems? So we went to all those different departments, including theology and philosophy, I might add, and we brought them together to work for a couple of years on a response to health and climate change. And they produced a fantastic commission report, which led to another commission report, another commission on planetary health. Now what we have, which is the countdown on the Lancet countdown on health and climate change, which is an annual report. It's a bit like the IPCC, except it focuses on health. We work in partnership with WHO, Maria Neira, and we do a great job with them. They're fully behind us and we're fully behind them. So we're not being competitive. And it's an example of how, with a very difficult problem, if you bring people together, you give them the ownership, we give it to UCL and all of our partners, it's not just about the Lancet, then you can do something amazing. And we've tried to do that across, I don't know, we published 50 or 60 of these commissions across a whole range of subjects. And we're doing eco-civilization and health, which I don't always forget, Tsinghua, HKU, it's sort of Pung sort of moved, so I'm not quite sure whether it's which one it is, but it's both. And, you know, I would dearly love to do a project with HKU. So, you know, let's think of a subject that we could do together. We need to choose something that nobody else is working on, that is a really tough issue, where you can bring people together across departments, where you feel that HKU has a specific expertise and interest. Drop me an email. I'm up for it.
Well, there's a challenge out to everybody. I think we should get cracking on that one. So there's a question that has come in. What is your view on observational studies? Do you think they have the ability to generate reliable evidence?
I wonder if that person was in the last session, because that question came up in the last session, actually, or a similar one. And to cut a long answer from the last session short, probably not. And I don't want to throw out observational epidemiology completely, but I have, the mistakes that I've made at the Lancet are mistakes where I have put too much faith in observational epidemiology, and subsequently a different study design, for example, a randomized trial, or a larger study design has come along and proven that original observational epi study wrong. The point I would just expand upon there about where observational epi can go wrong. Often we're taught that systematic error is the great weakness of observational epidemiology. But I think the lesson I've learned from talking with trialists is that the greater threat to the validity of observational epidemiology is random error, that we deal with far too small sample sizes. And when you have small sample sizes, then the risk of getting a wrong result. I mean, I remember we ended up in we published not dozens of papers, but far too many papers. There was a big debate in the 90s or early 2000s about the safety of beta blockers and in heart disease and calcium antagonists. And we published all these papers with relative risks of 1.2 and 1.3. And Kurt Furberg, lovely guy, he was part of this movement against a lot of cardioactive drugs. And we published these papers suggesting that they cause more heart attacks, cause gastrointestinal bleeding, caused a whole panoply of problems based on really, really small risk ratios. And honestly, it was all nonsense. And we should never have done it. But we did it because that was the evidence, the methodologies that we had at the time. And it was not based on randomized trial evidence. And we ended up, unfortunately, misleading people, sowing doubt and controversy ourselves in the safety of drugs that people were on. And that was not a happy period. So I am very nervous now. When I see an observational epidemiology study, I tend to turn left very quickly from it. Sorry to say, unless it's very big, like biobank big.
Yes. So there was a recent estimate that the 25% of randomized control trials have been falsified or at least problematic. What do you think about that, and what can we do about it?
Have been falsified?
Yes.
Well, I would say I'd love to see the evidence that they've actually been, that they've been falsified. What does that mean? If it means that in a study where you're recruiting 10,000 people, one study center has a problem and you have to exclude patients from that study center, yes, that happens. And it's not uncommon that that happens. And it needs to be written into the protocol what you do about it when it happens. But that doesn't mean to say that 25% of randomized trials are falsified. It means to say that human beings are human beings, and there are some bad people in society, and there are careless people in society, and there are bad and careless people in science, and we need to manage it as a problem rather than just say that a quarter of trials are, useless. So I always get nervous about figures like that. I do think, though, I think there's a bigger problem, and that is small trials, and it comes back to the issue of random error again. And this is where we need to be very, very careful. When you look at a trial, and I never look at the number of patients recruited into a trial. I never look at the power calculation. What I look for are the number of events. And if the number of events, if there's 20 events or 30 events different between the two groups, sorry, that's not going to be for the Lancet, because that's too small. The number of events are too small. So I want to see a larger number of events as difference between the active versus the control arm of a trial, if it's a simple trial. So that's, again, it comes back to the size difference in the outcomes that I think should be the determining factor. And that is a bigger problem, I think, than research fraud, that too many of those small trials get published, and then that can be highly misleading because people don't think of science as a process. They think of every paper as an event. And science isn't about a series of events. It is a process. And this is why we need to have rolling systematic reviews. And this is where AI can help us. And the reason I say that is that a friend of mine, Chris Murray at the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation at the University of Washington, University of Washington in Seattle. He does not thousands, but hundreds of systematic reviews that go into his global burden of disease studies. And he's now trialing AI to trawl the literature to be able to very rapidly update on a real-time basis the evidence from studies. So I'm very excited about that prospect.
Yeah, I'm Stephen Chen from the Chinese U Hong Kong, the oncology department. Dr. Horton, I really enjoy your talk. If you don't mind, I would like to shift the topic a bit to cancer and a bit more practical. Of course, as oncologists, our dream is to publish Lancet. But our experience, especially clinical trials, sometimes when we submit to Lancet, it gets referred to your sister journal, Lancet Oncology. So the practical question is,
that came up
and sometimes when I try to look at the differences that published in Lancet Oncology and Lancet is I don't see that much. Sometimes I do consider some really novel trials, very important result getting published or referred to the Lancet Oncology. How you decide? Could you advise me or our oncologists or other colleagues working in the cancer field? What kind of paper you consider more in the Lancet? What kind of paper you consider in institute sister journals?
So this exact same question came up in the previous session. My colleague who edits the Lancet Oncology, David Collingridge, lovely guy, but we're competitors. And so David wants to steal all the cancer papers and all the best cancer papers for his journal, as he should do. My job is to steal a few back for the weekly. And so we've developed a strategy, don't tell anybody about it. I don't want David to know, because we've appointed this wonderful PhD oncologist called Vanya Wisdom, and she's our oncology ambassador. And she's going out there stealing all David's best papers to bring them back to the weekly. Of course, we want to publish cancer papers in the weekly. What kind of papers? You need to make the case. I mean, the papers that we want to publish are papers that will be for an international audience, that will have some element of originality, that will be topical, they'll be scientifically interesting, and that they'll be good enough to have a good chance of being true. So in your submission, you need to show me your passion for why this paper is. Do you know what? The thing that drives me nuts is the way we teach science writing is all wrong, because we teach it as if it's this very clinical, we all have to be objective, we use the third person, and that's not the way we do science. You don't wake up in the morning and talk in the third person. You wake up in the morning and you want to come to work because you are absolutely committed to what you do. You love what you do and you want it to succeed. And then when you come and write the paper up, you drop your passion and you bore editors like me to death. And the only time I provoke you to tell me why you're so passionate is when I reject your paper, because then you write me an angry letter and tell me how you spent 5 years of your life. You're divorced, your children don't speak to you, you're bankrupt, you live in a box on the street, and you're committed to your work. And don't you understand, Editor Horton, how stupid you are because you haven't grasped the significance of this work. And then I say, oh, now you tell me. Now I understand why this work's important. So let's cut out that process. And when you submit your paper, write me a letter and tell me why you believe in the work you're doing, why you're passionate about it. And then you might have a better chance of getting published in the Lancet.
Right, so more passion.
More passion, more passion.
Yeah, we are close to the end, but one more question from online. What is your view on the current peer review process, and what are the challenges from the point of view of the editor to ensure high quality peer review process? And to that, may I add, during the pandemic, I believe journals are finding it, I don't know, it is only to do with infectious disease, but finding reviewers is becoming extremely difficult. And is leading to long delays in the review process. Anyway.
No, it's, I think we find the same. We're lucky. Reviewers and the papers that we send to reviewers are often interesting, even exciting, and so reviewers are keen to review them. So we're fortunate in that respect. I do think there's some basic misunderstandings about peer review. As I said before, sorry, for those of you who are in the previous session, peer review is misunderstood because people, and the public certainly, think somehow it's about testing the validity of a finding. And of course, it's not about that. We don't go off and redo the randomized trial or redo the modeling experiment or redo the observational epi. What we do is we send it to a bunch of experts who then make a judgment, and then we talk about it as editors. It's not about validity, it's about acceptability. Is the work acceptable to hopefully a reasonable group of peers and people who are trying to impartially assess a paper in as unbiased way as possible, accepting that nobody's ever totally unbiased. So when you realize that peer review is about acceptability and that it's a human process, not a scientific process, and so we can make mistakes sometimes, both ways, accepting papers and rejecting papers, then I think you should feel a bit more empowered in the way you deal with editors. So if we reject a paper and you think we've made a mistake because the peer reviewers have got it wrong or we as editors have got it wrong, challenge us. Tell us why we've got it wrong. Engage with us. We're human beings too. So let's have a conversation about the science and why you think. We may not agree with you and we may still reject it, but I can tell you I see, I don't know, half a dozen appeals a week, and at least one or two get through in the sense that we reopen negotiations with the authors because the authors make a good case that we made a mistake during the peer review process. So don't think of, peer review is not refereeing. It's not a referee blowing a whistle and saying, red card, no longer want to see that paper. That is not what peer review is. Peer review is a negotiation between the editor and the author about the scope of the claim being made in the paper. And you can challenge that in the negotiation. So feel more empowered to engage with editors. Maybe that's a good note to end.
Yes, I've got a red card from,
Okay.
from
A red card.
So on that note, we shall end. Thank you
Okay,
so much
thanks a
for
lot.
your talk.
Thanks, Malik.
For the Q&A.
That's great.
Thank you, everyone, for your questions. Thank you, Professor Pierres, for the facilitation of this passionate discussion, and for Dr. Horton sharing as well. Dr. Horton, you may remain on the stage. I would like to invite Dr. Wendy Lam, Associate Professor and Acting Director of the School of Public Health, to present a token of appreciation to our keynote speaker. The souvenir serves as a symbol of our gratitude for his enlightening speech this afternoon. Please remain on stage. Now let's take a group photo. May we also invite Professor C.S. Lau, Dean of Li Ka-shing Faculty of Medicine, Dr. Helena Wang, Asia Executive Editor of The Lancet, Professor Vivian Lin, Dr. Mary Schooling, Professor Maggie Wang, and Professor Malik Pierres to take a photo on stage, please. Thank you all. Please join our audience off stage to take a group photo. Okay, audience members may move towards the center of the hall to take a group photo, please. So, audience members, please move towards the center of the hall to take a group photo. Our staff are handing out some photo props to take photos with you. Please stand up.
Stand up.
Please move to the center as best as you can to be included in the photo. Okay. Thank you so much. You may return to your seats. This concludes today's lecture. On behalf of the HKU School of Public Health, I would like to express our deepest gratitude for all for being here with us this afternoon. We hope you've taken home with you inspirations and food for thoughts to look back and to look forward. So thank you once again and wish you all a pleasant day. Goodbye.